Without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's speaker, Simon Henson. Simon graduated from Leicester College of Arts in England, majoring in sculpture and design, like a beaver. He pursued a career as a professional artist and an arts educator, first in England and then in Canada after emigrating here in 1970. I first met Simon in the photography club, where he is the undisputed elder and sage, as well as a fantastic artist and educator. Living on the West Coast has provided both subject matter and inspiration for much of Simon's sculpture and photography. His work reflects a lifelong involvement and love of nature, capturing the essence and personality of coastal wildlife and landscapes. As a naturalist, Simon developed and led interpretive programs in a variety of capital region and provincial parks on Vancouver Island, and has volunteered as a warden for the Salt Spring Ecological Reserves and this Conservancy. For over 9 years, Simon was the resident photographer with the Conservancy. I think he still is, really. He continues to work towards creating a greater awareness of the needs for conservation and protection of both natural habitats and species at risk. The Blackburn Lake Beaver Project, by the way, Blackburn has been only Blackburn since 1907, but I couldn't find a native name for it, is an ongoing study that started over 8 years ago, looking at the important role of the beaver as a keystone species in the Cushion Creek watershed. Simon has made his home in Salt Spring for over 40 years, and I'm sure you will really appreciate his talk tonight. So if you have not done so already, please turn off your microphone. Probably best also if you turn off your camera during the talk, because that helps everybody with the bandwidth. And we will hold all questions to the end. If you have questions, please write them in the chat. And at the end of Simon's presentation, we'll go through and try to answer as many of your questions as possible. So Simon?
Yes, I'm here.
To you.
I'll share screen. Okay. So how's that look for everyone? Is that good?
That works well. Yeah, looks good, Simon.
Hey, you can hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. You're good.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. Thanks for taking time out tonight for this presentation. And as I also had this acknowledgement. Pierre has said that much better than me, so we'll just skip that. So as tonight is really about the sort of ongoing study, as I see it, probably way into the future, on these beavers at Blackburn. And tonight is about the first 8 years where I developed, this interest, and you can see what I've said there, that I was the warden in the early years here, and as I was walking through, became aware of the presence of the beaver. And until here at Blackburn, I've had no experience with beavers, sightings. I've been photographing wildlife, for over 40 years, but never beaver before. So the study has evolved over that 8 years, and like with any wildlife photography, to succeed in being in the right place at the right time with the right equipment, you need to get to know the animal you're studying, where they hang out, what they eat, their cycle through the seasons, do they migrate, etc. So for me, who wanted to take a look into the beaver and their lifestyle, I needed to get to know them. And online, there is an incredible amount of science and technical information on beavers. And tonight isn't about a lot of that. That can be found anywhere. The study was really in 3 components. First of all, I needed to understand the beavers and, their whole kind of lifestyle here at the lake. I then realized that the land use of Blackburn Lake has changed over the decades and in fact centuries. And also we're starting to get some really intense weather systems that make changes to the landscape as well. And that recent, in the 421 major flood that washed out the Forth of Ganges Road, a part of those changes that is happening here at Blackburn. So the common denominator that I was curious about is the beavers have been here for centuries through all sorts of changes, including the ones I've just mentioned. So how were they changing? How did that affect their day-to-day routine and so on? So just to give you a bit of a location, this was a public sort of survey of beaver sightings back in 2018 that people contributed. And you can see even of recently, there's a lot of beaver activity here on the island. But we at Blackburn are in the middle of what is referred to as the Cushion Creek watershed. And here's a much more informative map. So Cushion Creek starts in Roberts Lake, flows down through to our lake here at Blackburn. And in the old days, and this is what I'm really struggling to understand, usually when a beaver dams a lake to create a pond, to build a lodge as a resident location, that's the purpose of the dam. Now, we do know that the beavers have been damming the outflow of Cushion Creek from Blackburn Lake just before it hits the Forth of Ganges Road over many, many years. So I don't know how much or the size of the lake before the Forth of Ganges Road was built across the bottom, because in a way the highway is a physical dam. It's blocking the water flow out of Cushion Creek, and therefore culverts were built under the highway to take that water away. And the major flooding we've had in different years is the result of so much water coming down. The one culvert or two culverts could not deal with the input, and therefore it flowed over the road. So it's really hard to know how much the beaver contributed in the early years before, occupation of Salt Spring, to build their primary pond. So let's get to know the beavers. They are known as a keystone species, and there was an ecologist down in the States, Bob Payne, back in '69 of last century, who coined the phrase keystone species, and for the reasons that he has given down in that second paragraph. In other words, if you can imagine a natural beaver territory with the lodge, damming of a creek, creating a pond, building a home, and then extending the watershed to, supply their needs for food and building materials and so on. If we take the beaver out of those processes, nobody else in the wetland ecosystem would pick up that job. So really, beavers are designed by nature to be wetland engineers and managers. That's their purpose. They are one of the few animals that modify their habitat. And I've just mentioned their benefits. And you can see on that last sentence at the bottom, they have an incredible contribution to developing native wetlands. And this starts by building a dam. They'll choose a creek, or they're looking for a suitable home territory site. And when they feel that that area is going to be super topographically, they will dam a creek if possible. And eventually the water slows down behind the dam, overflows into the neighboring landscape, and a pond develops. And just to give you a bit of a kind of a map of what's happening here at Blackburn, because the lodge is situated on the edge of Blackburn Lake, the main resident lodge, there is a second lodge, and we'll talk about its purpose a little later. And they did start to dam the outflow of Cushing Creek where the Fulford Ganges Road is now. So presumably they had some activity to create what is known as their home or resident pond, which is the lake itself. And then they also dammed Hitchcock Creek that comes in from the north into the top end of Blackburn Lake. And they built a dam across it and created what we refer to as the Beaver Pond or Hitchcock Pond. And then the beavers have got this little extra pond, and we'll talk about all this later. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a reference here. You've got Hitchcock Creek coming in, dammed by the beavers and into the lake. You've got Cushing Creek, which comes, oops, sorry, let's go back, which goes through the Salt Spring Center land, through the lower third of the reserve, into the lake and out of the lake and under Fulford Ganges, subsequently on to Cushing Creek and then into the ocean at Bedders. So the smaller pond, Hitchcock Creek Pond, as I say, the creek comes in at the top, flows through here. There's a beaver dam and it flows into the lake. And you can see from the notes here what benefits Beaver Pond provide as a wetland. And I don't need to paraphrase it, you can just kind of read that information. But the focal point of a beaver family is their lodge. So that is where their main resident is. It's a safe place in the climate. Because they build it in the water, in the pond itself, or certainly in the wetlands, land predators cannot approach it. And the only way that you can get into a beaver lodge is underwater. So it's a very safe piece of architecture. And so this is that primary lodge taken way back in 15 from the watershed. And this was by canoe going in, and you can see a closer view of it. This is not my drawing, by the way. I just scooped this off the internet, but I thought it would be interesting to let you know life in the lodge and a little bit about family life and what the beavers are really doing at the lodge. And over on the right here, you can see a normal kind of resident family and what it comprises. You'll get the breeding pair who will have each year, if possible, and they breed successfully, newborn kits. And then the last year's kits, or the yearlings, stay with this family grouping for maybe up to 2 years. And you can see that by the time they reach 2 years old, they are expelled, and basically they go to look for their own territory, place to build a lodge. And that's the way that the colonies in a vast wetlands, like in, the Northern Ontario, places like that. This is how beaver colonies are created. But the particular lodge we have here at Blackburn is really this unit here. You've got the parents who had the kits for the breeding season, and then you've got the 1-year-olds that, interestingly enough, they stay with this family unit during that year. And when the kits are born, you can imagine it gets a little crowded up there. This is a sleeping quarters, a breeding quarters, and so on. What usually happens when the kits are born is the male, the dad, goes to the second auxiliary lodge, and its function is to be a home away from home for one of these parents. So the male leaves the residence and goes and lives out of the auxiliary lodge, while the mother and the yearlings actually take care of the newborn kids. And one of the, I thought this was kind of cute, one of the chores, if you like, of the yearlings is that their job is to make sure that the bedding that the yearlings are pooping and peeing on and whatever is kept clean. So they will, every 2 or 3 days, they will take the bedding from the chamber down into the water and leave it for a few hours. And then later they'll take it they'll take it back up into the chamber. It's like doing the laundry, fresh bedding, nice and clean, so the kits don't get any concern with bacteria and infection and so on. I thought that was kind of an interesting function that they did. They also help with grooming the kits, and then when they get a little older and are weaned from their mother's milk, they actually will, the yearlings will go off and buy and forage for vegetation that they'll bring back to help feed the kits. Now, once the mother wants to wean the kits, she does an exchange with dad. She will go over to the auxiliary lodge and isolate herself from the kids so they can no longer nurse. She's out of there altogether. And then the father beaver comes, carries on the grooming and caring and feeding of them. So that just some interesting aspects of beaver family life and how it's all sort of separated. Now, here is a quick life cycle. Again, I'm not going to read it all out, but this was important for me to know because I wanted to know when I could possibly see beaver activity, where they might be and at what times of the year. And you can see during the spring and nursing right through the early summer, everybody's in the lodge. It's no good me trying to get images, even by camera traps, during the summertime because there's no beavers out and about until later on when that happens in August. The other difficulty about getting information, in this region, beavers are nocturnal. I'm not nocturnal. So there was a bit of a misfit as when I was out and about with my camera and they were out and about doing their thing, and it was often 12 hours on a different shift. So we did set up some cameras over the years, and we got some video and some still footage that has led to some of the information that I was able to develop to give me a better sense of what was happening here in this particular residency. There's been some interesting research into identifying individual beavers, and there's some success in tail shape and size, even within family identification, as well as individuals. This is ongoing, but there has been some evidence, like the patterns on a giraffe's neck and so on, that these could identify individuals if you got to know them quite thoroughly. This was a great year for me. I had these cameras set up where I knew they were feeding, and in 2017, that spring, this is the mother. She had 3 kits, and these kits came out, triggering the camera just moments apart, and you can see a slight different size. So I know that that year they successfully bred and had a family of 3. And here was a really endearing set of images of the little runt or the little tiny kit with its mom. And even as she's feeding, so is the kit nursing at the same time. And I thought that was a wonderful capture.
Really?
So once you're extending your family, then you need to extend your territory. You need to get a source of food, constantly repair the dam and fix your lodge and do all this kind of maintenance stuff. So you need to spread out. And the way that beavers spread out is to create a series of navigable trails and canals. And usually they will choose a particular entry and exit point from a wetland or their pond and keep using it over a period of time. And you can see that as the water levels come up, as the rains come in the early winter, the overflow from their ponds starts to come down into these trails. And I believe this is part of their programming, knowing that water can excavate out these channels. I mean, that's part of what moving water does. So here's the same channel in the late winter that has been really, the pond is up here out of the picture to the bottom right, And this channel now is navigable into the Conservancy wetlands, and through the hardhack there in the distance is Blackburn Lake. So you've got this water system that the beavers can access all the way through. The opposite happens in the summertime. Obviously, when they are busy in the lodge and they're not fixing the dams or controlling water flow, they don't want to lose the water they've collected all through the winter. So they will actually dam those canals and channels to save that water level in the pond until such time as it rains again. This was a bit of a surprise to me. I just always thought beavers chomped down trees and nibbled on the branches and the bark, and basically that was their diet. But in actual fact, they are herbivores. They have a very mixed, complex diet, and you can see changes through the seasons. So during the spring and summer, when there's fresh growth and fresh rhizomes in the water lilies and cattails and the aquatic plants, they will feed on those. But as the summer progresses and that material becomes dry and fibrous, they'll get more into the nuts and berries of trees and shrubs, but start to do that kind of tree bark nourishment, which is really their winter diet. And this is a classic example of the leftover from a beaver meal. These are willow branches that they've been nibbling on. They'll eat the bark and the cambium layer of branches in the trees, and it's just chew around it like a corn of the cob and throw the pith away. Here's a little bit of footage that you see during the winter. You can see from the date, this is December. It's usually the adult parents that go out foraging during the winter, not the yearlings. And you can see from the behavior here, this just runs for another minute or two, that there's a selectiveness of the kind of plant material or the roots or whatever it is he or she is searching for as a food source. And my understanding from her bringing that into the pond or swimming with it, that they're probably taking that back to the lodge. There she is. And in March, probably the parent pair, this is a canal that's up near the Hitchcock Pond, and they're out and about, and you can see that they're just foraging, very different kind of diet at this time of the year. But they do go out and get some of this greenery and water lily rhizomes if they can, which is one of their favorites, as well as just working with trees. Now, something spooked them on, just see this, that you see there. I don't know whether it was the light from the camera or what, but something really bothered them. So here's your classic beaver feeding, vision that we all know and associate with the beaver. So when they take a tree down, it has multi functions. You can see some of the branches here in the foreground that they've been feeding on anyway. They often will choose a little bit of a spot in the wetlands, which is like their dining room. They'll take branches to this spot and sit there and chew away and do it time and time again. And it just seems to be a favorite spot. Or they'll visit the local buffet. I mean, they're not going to move a log like that around, but they certainly can enjoy the sustenance that it provides. I found this really interesting in terms of planning for the future. These are some young willow saplings that were planted and the new growth. But when they harvested, you'll notice that they will take the older growth, but they will leave all these younger saplings for future seasons as they grow bigger for future feeding. So this is a kind of way of managing their food supply. Beavers don't hibernate. As I've explained, they do live in the lodge during the winter. In colder climates, so when it's cold here, they will remain in the lodge, even if their pond and the canals are iced over. They can't really swim in that anyway. But in our climate, if it's mild enough, they do come out and they do carry on feeding during the winter months. And the same night that I took this photograph, I did manage to get a shot of the beaver actually doing the feeding. They will take food through the fall, particularly before the cold, icy weather comes in, and they literally build a pantry and a cache of food under their lodge. And you can see here, this is all food. The lodge is further back in terms of the structure underwater. This is all food supply in case they're stuck under the ice that season. Now, not everybody's interested in photographs of beaver poop, but it is quite significant in a way because mostly they defecate in the water, and it's almost never see their poop on dry land. And when I came across this, I was really quite amazed, but it really told me, and just looking at the composition, it was almost like wood fiberboard, and it's not surprising when you think of their diet. So once they built a territory, they want to own that real estate. Each family has its own territory, if you like, that they possess. So to mark their territory against other beavers coming looking for suitable sites, they build what are called scent mounds. And here is a scent mound that is built. And they're like cairns that they're at odd places around the perimeter of their territory. And the scent mounds are built from material from the bottom of their ponds, just rotten leaves and vegetation and mud. And in order to identify that this is their territory, they have these castoreum glands underneath their tail, which secretes an oil that they squirt onto this scent mound. And that chemical smell will indicate to incoming beavers, this space is already taken, this is our territory, this is the boundary. And usually does deter other beavers from setting up nearby. There's an incredible amount of research done on how beavers are actually helping the biodiversity of a wetland habitat. And here is some of the attributes, if you like, of particularly developing a fish ecosystem for fish. And I don't need to read all the labels, but in areas where beavers have built these ponds and access between creeks, researchers have said that the presence of fish has doubled, and that some old salmon creeks that were dried up have regenerated and have now got salmon fry coming up. And it's been a wonderful success story in terms of the fisheries. This was something I noticed on the side of the scent mound at Hitchcock Pond. And I really got excited when I started to investigate. It turns out to be a freshwater mussel. Now, from what I've read online, 75% of the world's freshwater mussels are species at risk. They're really, really struggling. So to have freshwater mussels in the ponds here at Blackburn was a real treat. And I started to research the mussel, in terms of why they're there, to learn, obviously their presence. And you can see down below that these animals in themselves have a wonderful attribute to wetlands, what they provide as a service and so on. So how did they get there? Well, it's kind of this wonderful chain reaction. The beavers create these waterway systems and ponds, and the fish start to migrate and use this new water system. And mussels, once they have expelled their young, the young will sense a fish swimming nearby, will swim up and attach themselves to the gills and sometimes the fins of the fish and host a ride. They'll really use this as a way of transporting themselves further upstream into different ponds, where they will leap off when they think they found a new pond in a new area, settle in the mud and create a new mussel colony. So here we have this water system that started by the beavers, used by the fish, transporting these mussels, and others. Is a wonderful relationship to create these ecosystems. This is one of the wetland restorations here, not a beaver pond, but I just wanted to illustrate the other attribute that beaver ponds provide. You'll notice the vegetation is a circular rim of these older saplings, which is what they are. The parent trees are here along the ditch in the background. One thing that I found out, and I wondered why throughout the restoration that we've been doing here at Blackburn, there was thousands of these older saplings coming up. Well, the seeds float. I didn't realize that. They actually float in water. When they're cast in September and the wind carries them all over, it's good timing, because starting late September, October, you get the fall rainfall coming in, building the water table, filling these pond areas, and the seeds float into these ponds, and just through the winds and so on, will gradually build up on the outside perimeter rim of the pond. And then as the water levels rise, these seeds go higher up the slope, so that by the early spring, when the water recedes, these seeds are left high up on the bank. And here's an example. The wetlands are down below. There's a slope up here. The water table came up to this level of the slope, deposited the seeds, and then retreated in the spring. So now you have a way that this wetland native species is distributed further around the wetlands, and again contributed to more waterways and more pond activity. Okay, so that's the beavers. That's a big chunk of the information about, what they are in a normal beaver world. Of course, that isn't the case, unfortunately. And as you can see here, the land use has changed since 1900. The name Blackburn Lake originated because Alan Blackburn was a Scotsman from Skye, bought the old farm from Corey and set about draining the pastures so he could run a dairy herd. Now, he ran a very successful dairy business. He supplied his milk products to the creamery down in Fulford there for many years, and it was an incredibly popular business. But in order to get pasture, he needed to drain the wetland areas that were native wetlands just from the lake overflowing and the creek waters and the rainfall, a series of ditches and so on. So this was the beginning, in terms of the beavers' use, of taking away some of that vital water that they were using for their territorial needs. And that got worse big time when in 1994, the farmland was then sold off to the owners that built the golf course. And the golf course went on for, I think it was 8 to 10 more years. But they did a major drainage. Obviously, the land around the lake was wet a lot of the time. Excuse me. They only opened during the spring, summer, and fall, but even in the spring and fall, there was a lot of water around. So they put in an incredible amount of drain material, which further drained the land and basically pushed the beavers almost back into the lakes. I mean, it took away their whole habitat. And in September 2013, when the Conservancy acquired the property, the intention was, in the planning at that time, is to reverse that process, try to get some of that wetland area to its natural habitat, which is what it should have been right from the beginning. So what the golf course did originally, and here's a little bit of a quick history of the restoration. In the wet areas, particularly in the south end, below Cushion Creek, and a little bit up at the bottom of the long fairway, just almost at the dam area of where Hitchcock Pond is, they had these long boardwalks for the golfers to walk along and move their carts on so they wouldn't get wet and muddy. That had to go. And this was the process of removing it. I don't need to talk about it a lot. There were some really disgusting materials, but the rubber membrane that lined underneath the boardwalk prevented anything growing up, any water flowing, and certainly stopped the beavers traveling across them. So once that had gone, you suddenly here was, I mean, the beavers must have thought they were in Venice on the Grand Canal. And there was this new waterways, access from the lake into their territory, free for the first time in decades. Continuing restoration, it started south of Cushion Creek, between Cushion Creek and the Fulford Ganges Road, where there was some major landscaping done back then. Excuse me, and you can see just that process here, protecting the seeds, planting in wetland native plants, putting some shade trees in, or some future forest shade trees to create the tree ecosystem. And a few years later is what that restoration became, which I think is a real success story. And just through here, through this snag, is Blackburn Lake. And there's all sorts of passageways through this wetland for the beavers to access into this whole new wetland area. North of Cushion Creek was a whole different problem. Here was the main golf course, the main drainage. Now this looks about as far away from a wetland ecosystem as you can get. It's virtually desert. So you can imagine, for the beavers' needs, this was deadly. So in order to get rid of it, this was a much bigger project than the southern section. First, the invasive species plants were removed. There was the topsoil, but under the topsoil was truckload and truckload of sand that was brought in to lay the drainage in and to be underneath the tees of the golf course. And it took a lot of excavating to get down to the natural clay sediment that retained the groundwater. It was horrendous. So this is the old fairway. The green is at the top here. This is the Hitchcock Pond. You remember you saw the mother with the kits feeding on a horizontal log. That was this willow tree. They took this willow tree down and set up a camera there and got some wonderful shots of them feeding there. The beaver dam is just through the trees here. But this was before the restoration, and again, provided nothing, and in the summer just became a dry landscape. After the restoration work that was done in September 2017, by the end of the winter rains, you can see how much of the groundwater was recovered. The lake levels were treated, but the groundwater stayed within this system, certainly didn't have that vast drainage that the golf course had put in. And subsequently, many years later, this is looking up towards the center. Here's the nursery on the hillside, and this is looking up towards the Hitchcock Pond. So really a success story. Imagine this originally as the golf course. So the beavers, imagine the beavers now having all this water as an attribute to their lifestyle, their access to food, building materials, and so on. It was just incredible. But there was a problem. The problem was that the beavers are natural wetland engineers. The Conservancy's restoration program is all about restoring to a wetland ecosystem. So you've got two organizations working on a wetland habitat. And there were times when they crossed over. So the main waters left behind here was a result of digging out the ponds for the restoration. And these plantings were future trees for part of the wetlands. However, the beaver didn't understand that. The beavers did what beavers do. They came and harvested, probably didn't understand what these strange structures were. And of course, there was this conflict with part damage to what was being done in a land use plan. So this is where I'm beginning to create this comments about opening up that awareness of collaborating and creating a relationship with the beaver's lifestyle when land use decisions are made. They're here to stay. This is their territory. They've always been here, but we don't want to destroy the incredible effort and funding that goes into creating these lands. Now, on the flip side of the coin, this is where land use really dumped on the beaver. The Beaver Dam across Hitchcock Creek, the ponds up here, was covered over with a wooden bridge by the golf course people. And that was a problem. You can see that there's no way the beaver can get into and under this massive structure to repair, to increase the height of, to supply the needs to maintain that dam. It was just a disaster for them. And that went on for 10 or 20 years until the Conservancy took over. So what they did, the dam is up here, downstream, and the outflow of Hitchcock Creek. They tried a second one in January 2017. But 2017 was the year we had some major flooding and major creek flows. So by February, that second dam had all but been washed away. You can see the original dam under the bridge there. They never went back to it. They never tried it again. They just gave up. Which brings me to this last phase of the study, which is climate change and how that's affecting the beavers. I mentioned the heavy flooding. There's also times when you can get heavy snow, and what happens to the beaver in the process. Now, this is the early parts of the southern section of the restoration and one of the early winters. You can see the tree plantings in the distance. But in February 2017, we had a lot of snow, and it persisted for quite a long time. And as the warming up happened, the snow melted, and there was a lot of snow to melt. And that was followed by days and days and days of torrential rain. Now, this shows you, just a reminder, you've got Cushion Creek flowing into the lake and out of the lake, Hitchcock Creek flowing into the beaver pond and into the lake. The golf course had built a road over Cushion Creek called a land bridge, and it had a culvert through, just like the culvert on the main road. And they had some rickety wooden bridges for foot passage over the creek. So the Conservancy repaired the wood bridge. It was in bad shape. It was a liability to the public. And once they took ownership and had access for the visiting public to come through, they needed to have a safe bridge. The land bridge was a different matter. So what happened during those heavy rains, you can see the snow still there that was melting. Remember when I showed you the Cushion Creek watershed starts at Roberts Lake, comes all the way down to Blackburn Lake. All that water, all that runoff from Mount Belcher and the highlands north of Blackburn rushed into Cushion Creek and came hurling down with rocks and boulders and tree stumps. And this poor little culvert couldn't deal with it at all. Blocked and eventually just became a dam. So the creek blocked the culvert underneath, started to flow over the top and go sideways into the restoration area and sideways into the meadows here. So this is looking from the restoration. The creek's going through here, but it's overflowing into all this new restoration work that was done and depositing a huge amount of sediment and silt into the new planted area. This was a major setback for the planting material. So a decision was made that for now, access to the southern section would rely on the wooden bridge only, and that the need to have this land bridge rebuilt, putting another culvert in with the way that the weather was changing and the annual rainfall was increasing and these atmospheric rivers were developing, was no culvert was a match for that. So they decided to put the creek back to being a creek. So it was excavated out, lining of a creek. You can see the willow saplings here for future vegetations. And it was an amazing success story. Here is, as the next winter rains comes in, flows right through, nothing to stop it, nothing to seep sideways into the wetlands. Because of the increased velocity of the flow, there was a certain amount of restoration done on the corners, which were getting eroded away into the landscape. And there were two places this was done. You can see these saplings put in at the top and the deer fence. But somebody realized also beavers now were using the creek, and they put this fence on the inside as a protection against the beaver, at least until these saplings had taken root, were holding the soil of the bank in order to protect them. But the beavers were back. Oh boy, did they enjoy an open creek again. I don't know how long it had been since they were able to travel from the lake all the way up the creek through the Salt Spring Center lands, and who knows if they even went to visit their relatives at Roberts Lake. I mean, it was just a wonderful access for them. But I did notice quite a lot more activity of their foraging at the south end of the reserve then. And here's the beaver actually on that same tree gnawing away. They get quite artistic. Here we have a wonderful, I guess I'm interpreting it a little bit as an artist, as a figurative sculpture, but I thought this was such a cool image. And of course, the creek then provided this wonderful habitat for other water-loving creatures. These are river otters, and this was caught on camera just about a week ago, that we just happened to see in the daytime. These three came up and were frolicking on the bank. Now, this bank, by the way, is the same curved restoration bank that I showed you with the fencing. So these are now the grown-up saplings that the beavers are starting to eat. They've taken root, they're protecting the bank, and they've become a playground for other creatures. And of course, those sediment-filled wetlands south of the creek came back very healthfully. They're doing well, and it was a wonderful restoration recovery. Until November 21. Remember the big flood a couple of years ago? Just to remind you, this little yellow symbol in the background is the excavator that is actually repairing the washout of the Fulford Ganges Road. This is Blackburn Lake. This normally would be the vegetation that spread all the way outside the lake. but it's now totally flooded. But what was an incredible dramatic move for the beavers was that this was the wooden bridge that was sitting on top of their dam. Gone, swept away, no longer a barrier. So this was what was left of the dam. These are the concrete or the breeze block footings of that, what the bridge sat on. So it didn't take long for these beavers, this is December, shortly after the floods, for those beavers to actually start gathering materials and fix the dam. And they worked at this for several months. I'll just leave this on. So a month later, you can see how much they had repaired. 3 months later, this is in March, they're still collecting, bringing that material. So by March, they now have a very healthy dam. The flow is stopped. You notice they now have gone above the height of the original dam. And what that did, which was amazing, and it took me a while to figure this out, because the dam is higher, the pond level is also higher. This shows you the same dam in the summertime, just to show you that it was holding the water back even after 2 months of really, really long drought. So just to give an idea of what advantage this was for the beaver. So here's the primary residential lodge, the little auxiliary lodge. All the way through this vegetation is water to get through. This was my interpretation of the restoration wetlands that the Conservancy put in. This is the Beaver Dam, here's Hitchcock Creek coming through. They dammed it, no bridge there anymore. This water level rises, and all of a sudden you've got spillage in 3 really important directions. And over here is number 1. And number 1 was this little canal they built between the wetlands. And that's the one I showed you in the early slides that eroded away with the water, and they actually became that channel. Number 2 is interesting. This is the tip of the sort of southern tip, if you like, of the pond. And it overspills and branches into 2 directions up through the wetland trees up in here. You've got some incredible reeds, rushes, and a whole bunch of skunk cabbage dependent on this moisture coming from the beaver pond. And then down here, the videos I just showed you, the branches being pulled were along this canal. They harvested in this area and dragged it to the dam through the pond. So here's that canal that they were coming out. So all of a sudden, because the dam was higher, increased the height of this pond, the restoration created waterways. The beaver now had this whole water system to work with. And that was a major upgrade compared with what they were left with the golf course. And just to show you how important it is for their, they are semi-aquatic animals. Water is their life. And you can see that when they need to transport material, that they really need that water to assist them. Now, without water, it's a bit of a problem. I'm amazed that he's even got the kind of neck muscles and stuff and the determination. But you can see where, as things dry out, beavers need water. And that's why they build wetlands. Same camera location, getting drier, water levels drop. The wetland ponds are in the background here. And just to show you some of the foraging that they were doing, this again is in December. One of the parents out just feeding in the wintertime. And this was kind of neat. During the high winds we had a few weeks ago, there was a huge willow that split in two just below. This is the long fairway. Beaver Pond is up here. And this whole half of the willow tree, which was forked, split and lay down. So the beaver discovered this and came in and started to harvest it. It was just an amazing food source for them. The other thing I noticed was that a few weeks ago when we had that real cold snap, when the pond and the wetlands and the channels iced over, they could no longer travel that for feeding. So the only other major water course available to them was Cushion Creek. So they started to move their feeding activities back to the creek. And these are those same willow saplings that were planted to stop the bank eroding. They have started, this is just a week or two ago, to harvest because they could swim up the creek from the lake to a wood supply. And this shows a couple of clips. This is sitting on one of those benches. That's where the otters were playing. And this is the saplings that were stopping the bank eroding. So the beavers are down here doing their feeding. And during the snowstorm even, wait for it, still trying to get stuff back to the family in the lodge. Because it snowed, and I mentioned it's really hard because, you know, setting up cameras and photographing the beaver, because it all happens at night, is a guessing game. Excuse me, it's kind of like a chess game. They make a move, you move accordingly, thinking ahead of them, and then they move again, but it's not necessarily where you thought they were going to move. So finding an evidence of each year of did they give birth to young ones, how many are in the family, was really hard. But the one attribute is when they're out and about in the snow. So providing I can get out and about in the snow, at least I can go and look. So this is this year, late December. Here is the adult tracks, and just a few meters over is the twin tracks of two kits that will be born this year. So I know that this year there are at least 2 young born, and that was really reassuring. So to conclude, where do we go from here? Really, I understand, and I'm just in the middle of this journey of watching these guys. I do know that as changes take place, we have to think of what the beavers' needs are as well as the wetlands' needs, because the beavers are key to a wetland habitat and ecosystem. So a couple of thoughts here in the land management planning to think about the beavers, what they might do, and certainly if protection is needed with certain species of plantings until they mature, just be aware that you're exposing that material to beavers until you do take that protection. And something that I'm very passionate about, I guess, is to create this better understanding and awareness of the beavers through educational projects. I would like to see at the dam site at Hitchcock a little beaver station there, just a board with some information, placard, just as visiting public can walk down there, see the dam and get some of this information. And the journey continues.
Wow. Simon, thank
So,
you.
okay,
Thank
I'm
you.
just going to get rid, just let me get rid of my screen here. Okay, oh, there we go.
I know it's very commonplace for everybody, anybody who's hosting a presentation like this to say, "Oh, that was a great presentation," but I don't say that always. But this time, Simon, it really was. I've seldom seen anyone be able to give the breadth of information that you did about the natural history of beavers right down to the maps, to the understanding, the lay of the land. I'm a member of the board of Conservancy. I knew bits and bobs of what was going on, but not. I've learned so much tonight. So
Great.
thank you so much. So while I'm talking here, I'm hoping that people can put some of their questions in. I'll be scanning the chat and putting those questions to you just to get the ball rolling. What does
Okay.
castoreum smell like? Have you ever
Well,
bent over one of those mounds and
yeah.
taken a sniff?
Well, you probably don't want to hear this, but it's actually been used in cooking
Yeah.
and food. It's a lot like vanilla. It's actually quite a pleasant smell, apparently, is what I've heard.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it used in the perfume industry as well, I think? Just like
I think it was, Pierre,
yeah.
now you mention it. Yeah. As
Cool.
many of these creatures' organs are.
Okay, so some questions are coming through. A lot of thanks for all of the years, of course, that you dedicated to this project. Can you tell us something about the predators of beavers? What
About
about
the
cougars? What about those otters? Would they actually try to go after the kits?
no. Apparently not. There doesn't seem to be a conflict. They're both aquatic mammals and both in the same ecosystem. But no, the kits are almost as big as the otters. Yeah.
Right.
One little interesting story about once the kits are weaned, they're learning to swim is an interesting thing because at first they have a lot of flotation and they try to mimic the parents by diving into the water, but they're so float, they just bob up to the surface again. It's really funny, apparently, to watch them do that. And it takes a while. So when they're out and about, away from the safety of the lodge, they've grown quite a size, certainly the size of an otter. And they've got some, pretty protective parents around anyway for quite a long time. So I don't think there'd be any conflict with the otters. No.
So do we have anything on island that would? I don't think we have marten on island, or do we?
Have one?
Martens.
No. Not sure. Not sure.
Yeah.
I know that in some research in Oregon, which is a similar habitat, water voles will share a beaver lodge. They will tolerate each other. And even the voles will even take some bedding in as well and share it. But other aquatic mammals, the whole point that the lodge is in water with underwater access is there's almost no predators that can come in.
So. Okay. So another question, of course, is that given that sometimes we're working at cross purposes with the beaver, they're now eating the trees along the banks, and possibly that will cause more erosion down the road. They're entering some of the areas that we fenced in to protect some of the vegetation against the overabundant deer. What are your recommendations for the Conservancy on how to live with them?
Good question. I think in fairness to the fencing that was done, particularly in the north section, that was in consideration of the deer for the most part. I don't think there was a lot of evidence of the beaver and that they might get into that fence because they're pretty small openings in the deer fence and it would be hard to imagine. Just out of interest, I did go around a couple of the recent fenced areas where there's been workshop plantings. And I do notice a couple of areas between posts, because of the uneven ground, the beaver could get underneath. There are gaps. So a recommendation would be to go along the floor level of the compounds. And if there are gaps or loose stretches, just peg them down. But certainly in the future, maybe, I think the new compounds look more like a rabbit fence, where they got, for the first foot or two, they're a much smaller opening. So the beavers don't climb fences, they get through a lower part. So as long as the mesh is small enough lower down, and it's not allowed to rise up under dips, you should be able to keep them out.
Okay. Let's see. So there are questions about other parts of the island. I mean, one of them is, Somebody mentions Dunbabin Park,
Um,
and do you?
yeah,
I mean, how many beaver clusters do we have on Salt Spring? Do
I
you
don't
know?
know. I showed you that map,
Yeah.
and that was from people that had seen beaver evidence. I'd been to the Dunbagan Creek and I saw the beaver activity there, where Long Harbour Road joins Upper Ganges Road. Across the road is always beaver trying to block up the culvert that comes under the road there, and that's often cleared out. So
Hmm.
certainly that wetlands just in there by the hydro lines is beaver active. We used to have a lodge at Cushion Lake, but I live above Cushion Lake, and the neighbors have said they haven't seen beaver activity there for some time. But really my main focus, Pierre, because I've walked through here anyway, has been the Blackburn beavers. I wanted to get to know one family, because by knowing one family intimately and the nuances, I think I got more from it than a lot of sites where just by nature of numbers in the family, the access of food and that would be a different with each family. So I can't, I have no idea how many other successful residences there are.
Hmm. Somebody else had asked questions about the beaver's main implement, its teeth. Um, can you say
Brain,
something about its
um,
teeth
yeah,
and the fact that they keep growing? And can you say something about how
well,
specialized that
uh,
dentition is as rodents?
absolutely. If you look at the photographs of the bite marks in the trees, it's like having chisels in the front of your mouth, and those lower teeth particularly, as well as the upper ones, that are super sharp like chisels. They are, I used to have a beaver skull that I borrowed from the collection at the museum to look at. And the tooth root goes way back into the skull and continually grows. They have to keep chewing to wear the teeth down. There's been cases where they haven't had the right food and the teeth have grown into their mouth and locked, and they died of starvation. The other thing about the teeth is you'll notice they're bright orange color when you see them. And that's an iron pigment that is in the teeth. Whether that strengthens it, I'm not sure, but it has this iron pigment in the teeth. People always wonder why are beaver teeth bright orange, but they do continually grow. And like other rodents, they do need to be worn down constantly for safety, very
Right.
sharp.
Somebody says about, I guess you mentioned that alders were growing on the edge of the wetland. And the person says, I wonder if it's also because the soil is disturbed in creating the wetland, bringing up the mineral soil, because alders usually come into disturbed areas.
Yeah, excuse me. Oldest is a good indication of sorry, I get a froggy throat here.
Go ahead and take a minute and have a glass of water,
I
Simon.
know, yeah.
That'll help.
It's a good indication of where soil is moist if alders are growing. They follow ditches and wetlands and so on, but they only like a certain amount of water. You'll notice around our wetland ponds and the beaver pond that the ones adjacent to the ponds, the older alders have all died. And the reason they've died is that the restoration of the wetlands have brought the general water table up. And and for the closer to the deep water alders, that wasn't good. But the way that they migrate, when I walked through here in the snow, it was interesting that all the snow was covered with speckled with alder seeds. So you need, the moisture in order for it to be a successful germination. So in that margin between wet and dry is that ideal site for the seeds to germinate. There was lots of seeds on the fairways left out on the dry patches that never did germinate. And that's why they're in these long stretches, because it's only a narrow corridor of suitable soil and so on. Now, to answer the question about the soil being disturbed, alders do need a certain soil depth. That is important. And I think in the process of restoring the wetlands, topsoil was put back and built up. And just by topographically landscaping the wetlands, there was, high areas and mounds and so on. And that was with soil material. So in that sense, it was a perfect habitat for the alders. And the other thing about alders is that they are one of the first trees that people will plant in a restored area if the soil particular is very sterile, because the alders have a little nodule on their roots that collect nitrogen, and then that nitrogen is secreted into the soil. So they're soil builders, and they really, really increase the fertility of the soil by taking in nitrogen from the air, which is really cool. So very, very useful plant when you've had struggling other trees to take home.
Right. Wow. So a comment, I guess, more than a question, although in my mind it does lead to a question. Person says our area has streams have been filled and drained by beavers. I could add that every time somebody builds a road up to their house, they put ditches, and that helps drain the land. Beaver took up residence. Talking about a Baker Road pond. I heard a shot in the night and it was gone. So how do we begin to educate people that wetlands are good, drainage, speeding the water away from the land and into the sea is not necessarily the best thing we can do, not just for beavers, but also to keep the forest moist and protect us from fire. And so how do we start educating people? Beavers will actually are our best ally to keep the land moist and the forest healthy.
That's a tough general question, Pierre. I mean, if you just accept that the wetland ecosystem worldwide is one of the most threatened and one of the most valuable. So to me, as an opening statement to anybody, it's saying, that not encouraging wetlands or destroying wetlands is counterproductive to the health of this island, let alone other parts of the world. There's an incredible amount of information. Technically, the Department of Agriculture of Oregon, particularly of Washington, has got pages on working with beavers. Are you a farmer? Do you want to protect valuable trees? Do you want to stop land that you use alternatively from flooding? There are certain methods and materials that you can work with the beavers, that they can do their thing and allow, your need as well. You don't have to try and eradicate them.
Yeah, shoot and trap. That's what we do best.
But it's a question. Some people, they want every square foot of their land dry for their own purposes. They don't want it flooding. They don't want beavers to be part of their residency. And that's every individual's choice. It's a tough one.
Looking forward with the Blackburn beavers. So how much, is there enough area for several families? I mean, what happened to the kits? Where are they going to go?
Good question.
Expansion.
Good question, Pierre, because the Blackburn family territory is, already occupied. And each year we presume, or as many years as they breed, those 2-year-olds go somewhere. And I've always thought, where do they go? Well, we know they are very cumbersome on land. They can move on land, but it's not their choice. I've even driven up Stewart Road and watched this beaver flopping down the road towards me, before we went into the Cushion Lake area. They will probably follow creeks to look around for other territories, whether they go north up Cushion Creek and Hitchcock Creek or up into Roberts Lake. I'm really interested to know if there was a beaver residency at Roberts Creek. One would think so. It's the headwaters of Cushion Creek itself, and it's a very big wetland area. South into Cushion and so on. but I really don't know. I mean, there is predation on the island. There's dogs as well as people. Just being hit, the beaver that's stuffed here at the center. And I didn't forget to mention that when we were building the wooden bridge across the creek back in 2015, whenever it was, at the end of that week that we were building, Ken Terra, the excavator, came back to get his machine for the end of the week. And as he drove in, he found that beaver dead on the roadside on the Fulford Ganges Road. So we don't know whether it was a Cushion Lake parent coming up or whether it was one of the Blackburn Lake ones. And I held my breath, because if it was one of the breeding pair, then what would happen in terms of the next breeding cycle? And, you know, does one of the younger beavers then become the male? And I just don't know. But the kits generally, or the yearlings, do have to go elsewhere. And this is probably why we're seeing all of those indications of beaver activity throughout the island on that map, is they disperse and they can travel many, many miles following different creeks and waterways. I have no idea what happens if they don't find a place.
Yeah, has anybody looked at genetic bottlenecks in beavers? If they can't easily genetic bottlenecks. I mean, if we have the kit's coming back, you know, an adult is killed on the road, the kit comes back, mates with its mother.
Generally, that doesn't happen. And you see, one thing I did forget was that the beaver breeding pair are monogamous, and they mate for life. So,
and how long do they live?
Well, in the wild, 12 can be 15 years, 10 or 12 is average. But when one of them dies, obviously there has to be a replacement. And there is thought it might be one of the family members, or it could be another beaver coming in, you know, looking for a relationship.
Well, Valentine's Day is coming in a few weeks or sooner. All right, this is your last chance to ask any questions of the talk. I don't see any more questions. Oh, I'm sorry. That's what scroll is for. Okay. Okay, we are going to that. Oh, somebody is pointing out that yes, indeed, in the areas in the U.S. where fire risk is high, they're introducing beavers.
It's a fire retardant.
Where, to keep the land moist and fire free. And as I was saying, I think beavers is one of the best allies we have to keep our forests healthy.
There was a credible amount of information about beavers, and I already sort of thought this presentation had a lot of stuff, Pierre. I could have put a lot more in there, but that was a really important point to advocate for beavers and wetlands, because where there are these wetlands, the groundwater is maintained, and apparently they're a real barrier for forest fires, because the vegetation is greener, it's moister, it doesn't burn, it doesn't die, and they've had forest fires come and literally stop at the edge of a wetland and not go any further. Absolutely. So huge benefit to forest fires.
Here's one more question that I quite interesting. We have our river otters, and they actually go in the ocean. Confuses a lot of people who think we have sea otters. Do beavers ever go into the sea?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm not sure what the reason they navigate is for food, probably in search, like the young ones, for a new territory, materials to repair the dam and the lodge, and they stay usually in a water area to protect themselves for prey. So if you look at all of those purposes, I don't see where they'd go into salt water, because I don't know what the purpose would be. There's no trees out there. There's no partners out there. There's no building material to bring back to the lodge, unless they just comb the beaches and pick up driftwood.
Although we have one comment here from Susan Hannon, who has answers to a lot of things biological. She says that she has heard, so this is like probably third hand by now at least, that ferry captains have seen beavers swimming between islands, assuming they can tell a beaver from a river otter.
You usually can. The beaver, when it swims, has just basically got its head above water.
Mm.
An otter, you'll sometimes see the curve of its back, and sometimes its tail will come out. And I would imagine a skipper of a ferry sees a lot of otters and whatever.
Yeah.
That would be really interesting. In
That
fact,
that is interesting. Yeah.
there goes another Google question for me.
So somebody, there's a few coming. I think we're good. If people want to leave, they can leave. But there's a few more questions coming. Dogs. We've had a lot of issues with dogs. I was at Huahuam yesterday, which is supposed to be dog on leash because it's full of flocks of widgeon and the mergansers and so on, and there were dogs running off leash everywhere. We have the same problem at Blackburn. How hard are dogs on beavers?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Pierre, because 2 days ago, when I went around and picked the memory cards of the camera, there was the camera, remember, on the creek where the erosion was, where there was a daytime clip on there, and I just saw the thumbnail and this dark shape. And I thought, my gosh, that's a beaver. But out in the daytime, didn't make sense. When I blew it up on the computer, well, I didn't blow it up, I enlarged it. It was a cockapoodle dog on a leash that the person was off leash, but it was down right where those clips of the beaver were taken, where they were foraging, sniffing around, obviously aware of the smells of beaver.
Sure.
And that really peed me off, because that dog scent for the beavers coming back that night would be a deterrent. I doubt the two would cross over, because one is a daytime activity and one is a nighttime activity. And the beavers are very aware of, they've got, not the best eyesight. And ironically, they don't have night vision. They're nocturnal, but they don't have the night vision that other deer has, where they have that membrane on the retina that reflects, you see reflecting at night like the deer do. And yet they do everything at night. They've got poorish eyesight, but they do, and it's often when it's a clearer skies when they go out and do most of their activity. But their sense of smell and hearing is really acute. So they might sense a dog in the area if there was one nearby, off leash or whatever. But yeah, it's a problem. And whether you go in, our reserves or Burgoyne, it's always dogs off leash, always.
Yeah, I think there is definitely some education that needs to be done there as well.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, and I don't see any more, let me scroll down. Nope, that's it. Simon, this was a wonderful talk. You have a wealth of experience. You've obviously spent a huge amount of time there looking, photographing.
It's 8 years, so
years and years of experience that you've managed to distill in a short talk. So on behalf of the Conservancy, I want to thank you very, very much. And wish you all the best. And I hope you can continue following these beavers for as long as possible.
I certainly intend to. Can I make a final request?
Yes.
I would just like to generally ask people if they have any information, sightings, activity about any beavers anywhere, if they could just, I'm happy to send out my email, or they could email not the Conservancy, Deborah has enough to do, but just generally let somebody know, and I'd love to add that to my data.
Yeah, so. and you know what? There are a few, and I think, Deborah, that the chat will be kept as well, right? That's part of the recording package. There are a few comments that have come in. Beavers at Roberts Lake between 2002 2008. Beavers, and I saw a few other places where people said, yeah, I think we have Ford Lake has beavers, which I believe is a Ducks Unlimited area, so that's really nice, and so on and so forth. So there's a few comments that have come in already on that, and hopefully more will. And Great. People can contact Simon through us at the Conservancy. And again, Once again, if you're not a member of the Conservancy, please join and support the sort of work that you've heard about tonight.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, Simon. Good night, everyone.